My name is Howard, and this is the story of the only shift I ever walked away from and never came back to. I was 23 then, working the overnight shift at a gas station off Route 40 outside a small town in Indiana. It was the kind of place that got steady business during the day and almost none after midnight, except truckers, insomniacs, and people who didn't want to be seen in town. I worked alone from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. most nights, clean the coffee area, restock cigarettes, mop when it got quiet, and try not to fall asleep between customers. There was a county deputy who stopped in most nights around 2:45 for coffee and sunflower seeds. Same order, same little conversation, same routine. That night he came in looking more alert than usual, not nervous exactly, just busy. He asked me if I'd seen a dark Ford pickup with no front plate and damage on the passenger side. I said no. He told me there'd been a serious incident at a trailer park about 15 miles east, and they were looking for a man who might be headed toward the highway. He didn't say homicide. He didn't need to. The way he said serious incident was enough. Then he left. I remember watching his taillights pull back onto the road and thinking that was the most interesting thing likely to happen all night. About half an hour later, a dark Ford pickup pulled into Pump 3. It had no front plate, and the scrape on the passenger side showed clearly under the canopy lights. I felt that cold, immediate kind of alertness you get before your brain has fully caught up. I don't mean fear exactly. It was more like my body making a decision ahead of me. The driver sat there for a few seconds with the engine running. Then he got out and came inside. He looked mid-30s, maybe. He was in jeans, a dark hoodie, and work boots. He looked ordinary enough that if I'd seen him in line at a grocery store, I wouldn't have remembered him later. That was part of what bothered me. Nothing about him announced itself, but his face had that tight, controlled look of somebody holding a lot in place at once. He came straight to the counter and asked for Marlboro Reds. His voice was steady. He laid cash on the counter, and while I was getting the cigarettes, he looked past me at the office door, then at the hallway to the restroom, then at the convex mirror in the back corner. He seemed to be checking the layout of the place, not casually, but thoroughly. I handed him the pack, and he asked if I was there alone. He smiled a little when he said it, like it was a joke, like something a customer might say on an overnight shift to tease you. I said, my manager was in the back. That was a lie. I was alone, and I think he knew it the second I said it. He nodded once and looked toward the office again. Then he asked if he could use the restroom. I told him yes, and buzzed the lock. He walked halfway there, stopped, and turned back toward me. Anybody else been through here in the last 20 minutes? He asked. That was the moment I first felt real fear. Up until then, I was still telling myself maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it was just the truck, maybe I was working myself up because of what the deputy said. But that question had a shape to it. He wasn't making conversation. He was trying to learn how much of a head start he had. I said no one has. He held my eyes for a second longer than was normal, then went to the restroom. The silent alarm button was under the counter to my right. I hit it multiple times the second the restroom door closed. And I stood there with my heart beating fast, trying to keep my breathing slow and listening to the sounds from the hallway. I heard no toilet flush or sink running. It was just quiet. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard the restroom door open, then footsteps coming back up the hall. He came back to the counter and set his hand on it. He leaned in slightly, then asked, "Your manager still in the back?" I said yeah. He looked at the office door again. Then he looked out the front windows toward the pumps. Then back at me. What kind of car does he drive? That question scared me more than if he'd just pulled a gun right then. It meant he was not improvising. He was thinking ahead, counting people, counting cars, trying to picture what was outside this building besides him and me. I shrugged and said, "White Chevy." There was no white Chevy outside. He knew that too. He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie, and for a second, I thought this was the point where it was going to become simple. Gun out, hands up, no more guessing. Instead, he pulled out a cell phone and set it on the counter. The phone had a pink case and a cracked screen. "Call this number," he said, and read one out to me. I just looked at him. He said it again, slower this time. Calm, patient. I picked up the store phone and dialed the number, because at that point, I didn't see another move. He watched my hands the entire time. The call rang once. Then, from inside his hoodie pocket, a second phone started vibrating. He let it do that for a moment, then took it out and ended the call without ever looking down. It took me a second to understand what he'd done. He had wanted to know whether I'd really called the number he gave me. He wanted to know if I was going to try something. That was the worst part of the whole thing for me, even now. Not that he was dangerous. I already knew that by then. It was how calm he was about checking me, how practiced it felt. He slipped both phones back into his hoodie and said very quietly, "If somebody comes in here, you act normal." I nodded. Then headlights swept across the front windows. He turned so fast, his whole body seemed to tighten at once. He looked back at me, and I saw the first real crack in him. Not panic, just pressure. The car pulled under the canopy and stopped at pump 1. It wasn't the deputy. It was an older man in a pickup. The man in the hoodie moved around the end of the counter before I could react and put something hard against my side under my shirt. He never fully showed it. He didn't need to. He said, "You ring him up. You say nothing." The customer came in half awake, bought $10 in gas and a coffee, and then left. I have no idea what I said to him. I know I got through it somehow because he didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. The second the truck pulled away, the man backed off from me and went to the front window. Then we both heard sirens. It wasn't close yet, but close enough. He stood there for maybe 2 seconds, then turned and walked out the front door without another word. He got back in the Ford and pulled out so fast, he clipped the curb by pump 3 hard enough to throw sparks. County deputies caught him less than 6 miles away after he ditched the truck near a soybean field and tried to run. The pink case phone he had with him belonged to his girlfriend. He had killed her in the trailer 2 towns over, less than an hour before he came into my station. He shot her, left, and started driving west with both phones still on him. I had to give a statement later that morning. Then another one, a week after that. The deputies told me I'd done everything right. The dispatcher told me the silent alarm reached them almost immediately. Everybody had something reassuring to say. I worked at the gas station for 3 more weeks and then quit. I told people I'd been meaning to leave anyway, but that wasn't true. The truth is, after that night, it didn't take much to put me on edge. A car pulling in too slowly would do it. So would a customer looking past me before they looked at me, like they were checking to see who else was there. I still stop for gas late at night sometimes, and every time I walk into a station and see one person behind the counter under those lights, I think about how easy it is to mistake quiet for safety. If you're enjoying these stories, you can subscribe. There are more like this every week. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 13 years. I've taken calls that would make most people's hands shake. Accidents, fires, people in the worst moments of their lives. After a while, you stop being surprised by most of it. You process it, you log it, you go home and move on. That's how it works, except for this one. It was a Tuesday night in February 2023, around 2 a.m. The shift was quiet in the way that February nights usually are. The cold keeps people indoors, which keeps the call volume low. I had 2 other dispatchers on with me, but we were spread across the room and nobody was talking much. Just the occasional call, the occasional radio check, and the low hum of the equipment. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. What flagged it immediately was the system alert that came up alongside it. A red indicator I'd only seen a handful of times in 13 years. The red indicator is a notification that the line the call was coming from had been listed as disconnected. Not just out of service, disconnected and delisted. The kind of status a line gets when it hasn't been active for years. There's a protocol for disconnected line calls. They're usually system errors, cross signals, or equipment malfunctions. You log them and move on to the next. I
911,
answered
what's your
it anyway.
emergency?
I don't know why. Something about the way it came through felt different from a system error. On the other end of the call was a woman's voice. Young, maybe early 20s. She wasn't screaming. That's the first thing I noticed. No panic in the conventional sense. She was speaking in the carefully measured way of someone who is trying very hard to stay calm and is right at the edge of being able to manage it. She said she needed help. She gave an address. I typed it into the system while she was still speaking. The address came up immediately, a residential property on the east side of the city. And alongside it was a flag I had never seen attached to a residential address before. A structure status notice. The building at that address had been destroyed in a fire in January of 2017. What remained was a cleared lot, no structure standing, no inhabitable space of any kind. I asked her to confirm the address. She confirmed it. Same street, same number, no hesitation. I asked her where she was in the house. She said, the kitchen. She said she'd been hearing someone moving around upstairs for the past 20 minutes and she was alone and she needed someone to come right now. I told her I was sending someone. I flagged the call as priority and dispatched 2 officers while keeping her on the line. Then I pulled up the property record on a second screen and sat looking at it while she breathed quietly on the other end. On the screen, it says, demolished following fire damage. Lot cleared 2018. No current structure. I asked her one more question. I asked her how long she'd lived there. She said her whole life. The 2 officers I dispatched arrived at the address in under 5 minutes. I had them on radio the whole time. The first thing the lead officer said when he got there was that there was no structure at the address, just a cleared lot. Overgrown grass, a concrete foundation, some debris at the edges. Exactly what the property record said. I told him I had a caller who had given that address and said she was inside a house at that location. He said there was no house. I asked him to check the foundation, to walk the lot. He did. He came back on the radio about 4 minutes later. His voice was slightly different from how it had been at the start of the call. Controlled, but different. He said there was no structure, but that there was something on the foundation. I asked him what. He said there was a coffee mug sitting on the concrete, right in the center of what would have been the kitchen floor, based on the foundation layout, and it was still warm. I didn't say anything for a moment. He then said there was something else. The grass around the foundation had been disturbed, not randomly, but in a pattern that suggested someone had been walking through the space recently. Back and forth, the way you'd move around inside a house if the house were still there. I asked him about the caller. He said there was nobody at the location. No person, no vehicle, nothing. I looked at my screen. The call was still active. The line was still open. I sat there for a moment, looking at the screen. Then I said her name into the headset. The name she'd given me when I asked at the beginning of the call. The line went dead immediately. I tried calling back the number, but the call didn't connect. At the end of my shift, I logged the call, documented the officer's findings, and as far as the official record was concerned, it was an anomalous call from a disconnected line with no person located at the address. I submitted the record and tried to move on, but I couldn't. I thought about it more than I should have over the following days. The voice mostly. The way she'd confirmed the address without hesitation. The way she'd said she'd lived there her whole life. 3 weeks later, one of the detectives I worked with occasionally stopped by the dispatch center. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, and then he mentioned the address. Not as a question, he just mentioned it the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows about. I asked him what had happened. He said the officers who'd responded to my call had flagged the disturbed ground on the foundation to the detective unit as a precaution, a standard procedure when ground disturbance is found at a property with a history. A team had gone out the following morning to assess it. He said they'd found remains buried beneath the foundation. A woman. Based on preliminary findings, she'd been there for approximately 5 years. I did the math while he was still talking. The fire that destroyed the house was in 2017. 5 years before the call, in February, put the burial at around 2018 after the fire, after the lot was cleared. Someone had buried her in the foundation of a house that no longer existed. I asked if they'd identified her. He said they were working on it, that the case was being handled by homicide, and that was all he could tell me. I haven't heard anything since and don't know if she was ever identified. In my 13 years as a dispatcher, I've learned to find rational explanations for things that don't immediately make sense. It's part of the job. You don't last long in this work if you can't locate things inside a framework that allows you to keep functioning. I still haven't found a framework for this one, and I don't think I'm going to. I worked the overnight front desk at a 24-hour emergency vet in Louisville for about a year. Most people who came in after midnight were upset in a very specific way. Even when they were trying to stay calm, their attention stayed on the animal. They wanted updates. They wanted timelines. They wanted somebody to tell them it was going to be okay. This man didn't. He came in a little after 3:30 in the morning carrying a black and tan shepherd with blood on one front paw and a torn ear. He said he'd found the dog near the shoulder of the highway and thought it had been hit. I called for the techs, and they came out with a gurney and took the dog straight back. He didn't follow them. He didn't ask how bad it looked. He didn't ask whether the doctor was in. He just stayed at the counter and said, "Do you guys scan for chips right away?" I told him, "Usually, yes." He nodded once and looked toward the treatment door. Then he asked, "If there's a chip, do you call the owner immediately?" That felt a little unusual, but not enough on its own. People ask all kinds of things when they bring in a stray. I said it depended on the condition of the animal. But if we had owner information, yes, we usually tried to make contact. He asked, "Do you tell them the dog's here, or do you just leave a message?" I remember looking at him for a second after that. It was too specific. Not the kind of question somebody asks because they care about a dog they found. More like he was trying to understand exactly what would happen next. I said, "We usually just try to reach them." He nodded again, then asked if he could wait. I told him that was fine. He sat in the chair closest to the front windows, where he could see the parking lot and the entrance at the same time. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't pace. He just sat there watching the lot. A few minutes later, one of the techs called me to the back. The dog was stable. Torn ear, cut paw, bruising, nothing life-threatening. She also told me something else. The dog had a collar mark, but no collar. Not just that. When the man's voice carried down the hall from the lobby, the dog started trembling so hard they had trouble holding him still. That was when I stopped thinking of him as somebody who had found a stray. The tech scanned for a chip while I was standing there. It came back with a local owner name and a phone number. I went back to the desk and called it from the clinic line. A woman answered on the second ring. She sounded like she had already been crying. I told her we had her dog and started giving the usual explanation about injuries and treatment. Before I even finished, she asked, "Did a man bring him in?" I said yes. There was a pause. Then she said, very quietly, "Please don't tell him you reached me." That was the moment it all started to make sense. She told me the dog was hers. She said the man was her ex-boyfriend. He had come by her apartment that night, drunk, banging on the door, and when she didn't let him in, he took the dog from the fenced patio before he left. She said he had done things like that before. Not taking the dog, but using whatever mattered to her to make sure she had to respond. Then she asked me the one question that made his behavior in the lobby make perfect sense. "Is he still there?" I said yes. She said, "He's waiting to see if I come." I looked up from the phone. He was still in the same chair by the window, but now he was watching me instead of the parking lot. I told her not to come to the clinic. I told her we would keep the dog in the back and that if she wanted, she could call the police and have someone meet her later in the morning. She thanked me and hung up. When I set the phone down, he got up and walked back to the counter. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier to deal with. He looked focused. "Did you get somebody?" he asked. I said, "We left a message." He held my eyes for a second, then smiled a little. Did you? I said yes. He looked toward the treatment door and said, "I should probably get going then." But he didn't move. He stayed right where he was, one hand on the counter, like he was still deciding something. Then he asked, "If somebody comes for the dog, do you just hand it over?" I said we had procedures for that. He nodded, still not moving. From the back, the shepherd started barking. Hard, not playful, not reactive. Just constant barking the way dogs do when somebody they don't want near them is too close. Something in his face changed when he heard that. Not much, just enough. He came around the end of the counter before I could say anything and headed toward the treatment hall. I stepped in front of him on instinct and told him he couldn't go back there. He stopped, looked at me, and said, "Move." Before I had to decide what to do next, one of the techs pushed through from the back with the doctor right behind her. The doctor told him very flatly that if he took one more step, she was calling the police. He stood there for a second, looking from me to the treatment door to the front windows. Then he nodded once, like he had finally worked something out. He turned around, walked out the front door, got in his truck, and left. We kept the dog in the back until morning. His owner came in later with a police officer and picked him up. She looked exhausted. She thanked the doctor, signed the paperwork, clipped the leash on, and left with the dog without saying much else. By then, the sun was already up. If you're new to Unlit Room and you enjoyed these stories, there are more like them on this channel. You can keep going from here.